Words, 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 words. Now that words have lost all meaning, here's our next speaker, Frazer McGinn, with the power of words, looking to demonstrate the importance of etymology in our modern world.
I never used to like books. Thousands of words spread across hundreds of pages. It was a concept that I had such a seated dislike for, that every time I used to open a book, let alone read it, an air of dread would appear. Of course, none of this was helped by Junior Cert English, where we were forced to learn endless Romeo and Juliet quotes, or face the infamous wrath of a teacher, who shall remain nameless, of giving you an 8 on your card. And believe me, trying to explain to your parents you got an 8 when the scale goes from 1 to 5 is no easy task. But this all changed for me. This dislike changed for me in 4th year, because I found and later became fascinated with etymology, the study of the origin of words. Let's give you a little example of this. Romeo and Juliet that I mentioned earlier is a tragedy. Do you know where the word tragedy comes from? It comes from the Greek, tragodia, which translates to goat song. Goat song. The story behind this strange origin is at the end of Greek plays, a goat would often be sacrificed to the gods. The sound of its cries later became associated with Greek tragedies. On a similar note of tragedies, a mortgage. I'm sure everyone knows what a mortgage is. Did you know it comes from the old French, mort and gage, which literally translates to death pledge? Don't worry, it's not as morbid as you may think. What it essentially bubbles down to is the deal will either die when the debt is paid or when the payment fails. Now, as I'm sure you can all imagine from this, when I whip out my etymology conversation, I quickly become the life of any party. But essentially what I realized from finding all this out is that every word has its own story. And I became fascinated by this. I spent hours upon hours researching and looking into how every word changed throughout the centuries, how it derived. And what I found from this is that there's so many words that exist in the world. Let's just give you an example of this. There's 171,000 words in the English language. That number only multiplies when you look at the some 7,100 languages that exist in the world. That's no small number. Now, many of these words are shared among the different languages with similar origins, but none of them are expressly the same. The one thing they do all have in common, they are all stories. That's 171,000 stories in the English language alone. That's 1,214,000,000 stories that exist throughout the world. That's really something to marvel at. And at this point, my faith in words and interest in the English language as a whole was starting to renew. But there was another significant step for me. And that was a book by the name of Night by Elie Wiesel. It's a rather heavy book documenting his time as a Holocaust survivor. But this book added so much context and reality to a subject that I had little previous understanding of. What hit me more about this book is this man told his life story through other stories. It's an odd concept when you think about it, but it added to the sense of power the book held. And from this, I decided to look at what the true power of words really was. And at the risk of sounding stupid, I never really realized how much we rely on words. It's what society is built on. It's how we communicate. It's how I'm talking to you right now. For me, that was always cast aside, taken for granted. I mean, who in their right mind thinks about words that much on a daily basis? Now, being the enthusiastic word buff I am now, I do. And through this, looking at all these words, I did discover the true power of words. And it's not any book. It's not any speech. It's not even the art of poetry. The true power of words is identity. We can see identity through the different languages that exist throughout the world. I said earlier there's 7,100. but we also see it within the same language. There's a massive variation in the different words that people use. Let's take English, for example. We will speak differently to an American, or to an Australian, or to a Briton. But we even see it more locally. A person from Cork, if you can manage to understand them, is going to use different words to a Dubliner. Now, this works on the simplest of levels, from just saying hello, good day, how's it going, or diagwitch. The simple act of saying hello, it extenuates your identity. It shows how you were brought up. It also works in more complex levels, with the creation of a dialect, a language within a language, if you will. The greatest example of this was within the concentration camps, when the Jews created their own language within German to come up with words to describe their suffering, because no suffering had ever been that great since then. The most harrowing example of this was Musulman. A person described as a Musulman was on the verge of death from starvation, exhaustion, and despair. A person at this stage had little, if any, life left in them, and usually died within a couple of days. And perhaps the most complex of this world of creation is the creation of a language. Creole is the language born out of the oppression of slaves, specifically the African slaves oppressed by the French in 1699. This language, whenever it's used, highlights and shines a light on the terrible atrocities that happened. Every time it uses, it keeps in the memory of the people so that it would never happen again, so this suffering is never felt again. Through etymology, we can see not only the evolution of words, but the evolution of society. Through these stories of individuality and identity, that's where we see the true power of words. Thank you very much.